Hi, Kevin Greene here. Welcome to Pathways to the Past. It's the middle of the Indiana winter, so I'm coming to you from inside my house this time. The weather's not been good for being outside filming, so the last video that I did, I told you all about the cyclone driving park that was in the Boulevards area in Seymour. And as I mentioned at the end of that video, this video is going to be about the exact same piece of property. And I'm going to tell the story of how and why it became known as the Stiegelmeyer addition to the city of Seymour. And my cat Jezebel has joined me, so I get a little bit of an interruption there. But in the last video, I actually walked the perimeter of the property. I won't be doing that again this time, but this is going to be interesting with the cat. Hang on. But the property that I'm talking about is basically Carter Boulevard, Lee Boulevard, and Kessler Boulevard. And the properties on both sides of each of those streets. And then from 2nd Street headed north up to about halfway between 4th and 5th Street. There's a jog in the block right in the middle of that block, and that was the north edge of the property that I'm talking about. But the story of say hi to Jezebel. The story of the property actually starts with the United States involvement in World War I. The U.S. government understood how important it was to keep supply lines open for the war effort across the United States, and railroads were the primary source of long-distance transportation at the time. So in December of 1917, the U.S. government took over control of all the railroads in the United States. That went on until early 1920, and there was a Senate bill passed in March of 1920 called the Transportation Act of 1920. And the main reason for the bill was to turn the railroads back over to private ownership and to give them the monies that they needed to stay in business and do the maintenance that needed to be done that had been neglected actually during the war. But like so many Senate bills, or bills in general, there were other things that were buried inside the bill, including a mandate. At the time, well, even today, railroads are divided into sections of track, and they're controlled by signals at each section, but it was up to the engineers to obey each signal. And for safety reasons, this mandate said that by the beginning of 1924, that this was aimed at passenger trains, or most passenger trains in the United States, needed to be equipped with a device called the automatic train control device. And basically what it would do is if the train entered a section of track that they weren't supposed to against a signal, that it would automatically apply the brakes and bring the train to a stop. So that gave inventors and industries across the United States an idea that if they could come up with the device to do that, they could make a lot of money. But it wasn't an easy task because the device had to be invented, patented, tested, get the approval by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then of course manufactured, and then convinced each railroad in the United States that your device was the one that needed to be purchased. So that introduces us to a fellow named Edward Stiegelmeyer. He had been born in Louisville, Kentucky, but as a child his family moved to Indianapolis, and he actually worked in Indianapolis as a firefighter up there. But he had long been an inventor and tinkerer, and he had primarily, for probably about 20 years before this, had worked on coming up with signaling devices that he was able to work with and sell to some of the railroads, particularly the New York Central line. They had shops in Indianapolis with the Big Four Railroad, is what it was called. So he worked for a couple of years to come up with his own version of the automatic train control device. And by early 1922, he was testing and came up with a pretty good idea. Most of the other people who were coming up with ideas were making them operate off of, they were electronic devices, and his device actually used air pressure instead, which was already on most of the trains because of the air brakes on the train. And so he, and it was probably true, he was convinced that his device would be more dependable and be less expensive for the railroads to install. So he started a company in Indianapolis it was just called the Automatic Train Control Company, and incorporated it and started manufacturing his device, getting ready to have it tested and approved by the government to be used, which it eventually was. But he understood the idea, or he thought up the idea that if he had his own locomotive, if the company owned a locomotive, they could go ahead and have the device installed, and then instead of having to work with each railroad to install onto their trains just to demonstrate it, he could just take his locomotive to each railroad and demonstrate it. And the cost for a locomotive that he needed was $10,000. So in September of 1922, he started visiting, setting up meetings in different towns around Indiana. And on, let's see, September the 19th, 1922, no, September the 15th, I'm sorry, 1922, he set up a meeting at the K&P building in downtown Seymour for the men of the town, the businessmen particularly. And what he was promising was that if he could get, he was going to sell $10,000 worth of stock in his company in Indianapolis to buy the locomotive, or use the funds to buy the locomotive. And he was promising that the town that could come up with the $10,000 promise to do this, that he would, once the device went into production, he would build a factory in that town, giving employment to quite a few people. He was estimating maybe as many as 1,000 people would be employed at a factory if things went as he hoped, I guess. So he was well received in Seymour, and as a matter of fact, on that first night, people of Seymour pledged $6,000 towards his goal of the $10,000. It's kind of interesting in the papers, the ladies weren't invited to, or weren't allowed to attend the meeting, and they were voiced their opinion of not being happy about that. So a few days later, he held a second meeting in the same place and invited anybody that wanted to come, and another $1,000 was pledged toward his goal that night. And it actually didn't take too many weeks after that the whole $10,000 was pledged from the people of Seymour. And so he announced that Seymour would be the location of a new factory, and he was going to start a new company called the Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company to build a factory in Seymour to produce the device. So his device was approved by the Interstate Commerce Commission. He just had to start going around to get railroads to agree to buy his device. In January of 1923, I have my handy-dandy timeline that I use for these videos. The Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company was incorporated. A capital stock set at $10 million. William Lee of Cleveland, Ohio was the president. He was actually the president of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen organization at the time. Stiegelmeyer was the general manager, and they were going to build this factory in Seymour. So all was set to go, except he needed a location to build this factory, and the property that he had his eye on was owned by the Bollinger family. It's actually the Bollingers who eventually would be the owners of J.C. Grubb Company. It's the same family. but they owned about 30 acres of property that was actually, I had originally thought that this property was at the east end of 2nd Street because I read someplace in one of the articles that that's where it was. But after further research, I've found that it was actually located, I guess the best place to tell you would be today Tipton Street and O'Brien Street. And Tipton Street at the time that this was going on was actually called High Street on that part of town. But from Tipton and O'Brien, going east along Tipton Street down to about where Captain D's is today, and then to the north all the way back to the railroad tracks. It was a farmland, so it was blank property, with the exception of the 2-story brick residence of the Bollinger residence was on the property, and Stiegelmeyer had plans to remodel that into the factory offices. But the price was $30,000, and he was looking for help from the city of Seymour to acquire this property. So there was a committee formed in Seymour, which was headed by the 3 presidents of the 3 banks in town at the time, and they came up with a plan. So there was this property just to the west edge of Seymour, which had contained the Cyclone driving park for many years, and it was up for sale. The park was no longer being used. And so this committee, the selling price for the property was $15,000. So the idea that they came up with, hi Jezebel, was that they would have the property surveyed and marked off into residential building lots. And they actually came up with 156 lots available for sale. They would have 3 streets running north and south along to get to each of the properties. But the selling price for each lot would be between $250 to $450, depending on the size of the lot. But if they could sell all these lots, they would have enough money to pay for the property that they're on, the $15,000, and have enough money to purchase the $30,000 Bollinger property for the factory site, and have some money left over for other expenses that would come up. So in February of 1923, so basically 100 years ago right now, the properties were staked off, and there was a write-up in the paper, kind of like you would hear government asking for help in a war effort. It was, do your patriotic duty to buy a lot on this new property for sale in order to bring this factory to town. And so on a Thursday, February the 15th, 1923, these lots went up for sale. And on the first day, 145 of the 156 lots sold. So it was a pretty good success. And if you look at the list of property owners, which was listed in the paper at the time, it reads like a who's who of Seymour business world at the time. It was businessmen of Seymour, and there were some individuals that bought as well. But there were even some that were listed as being purchased by the businesses themselves. So I think most of the people who bought the property really never intended on building houses to live there. They were just buying it as doing their patriotic duty as well as an investment property. That as part of the deal, each property owner in the Stiegelmeyer edition, which is the name of the new edition that they were going to call, would have stock in the new Stiegelmeyer property, the former Bollinger property. And the 3 streets in the new property, Carter Boulevard was named for Claude Carter, who was the head of the sales of the property for the new edition. Lee Boulevard was named for William Lee, who was the president of the Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company. Thanks, Jez. And Kessler Boulevard was named for Charles Kessler, who was the mayor of Seymour at the time. So by the end of that month, all except for 7 of the lots had sold, and Stiegelmeyer obtained the use of the Bollinger property. 5 months later, there still was not any factory being built, and Stiegelmeyer had a meeting in Seymour to talk to the stockholders and explain to them unavoidable delays. And mostly what was happening was the railroads across the United States were not real happy about this mandate. It was going to cost them quite a bit of money. It was estimated at between $2,000 to $5,000 per mile to install these devices. And so they were pushing back against the government about the mandate, and which caused the government to start delaying the deadline over and over. And of course, the railroads were not going to be purchasing the devices until they knew for sure whether or not they had to have them. So it's interesting to note that that the people who originally bought stock in the automatic train control company when Stiegelmeyer first came to town, that was the company that he started in Indianapolis. The Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company was a separate incorporation, so they didn't actually have any stock in that particular factory. But then we get into a little problem between the two companies. See, Stiegelmeyer actually had controlling interest in both companies, and he had made a contract between the two companies saying that the Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company would be selling the devices to the railroads and paying a commission to the Indianapolis group for manufacturing them until the new factory would be built. Which brings us to August of 1923, and there was a disgruntled stockholder in the Indianapolis company, the automatic train control company. And it wasn't anybody from Seymour, which they made clear in the newspaper. But apparently what it boiled down to eventually came out that this particular person was upset that he wasn't given a seat on the board of directors of the company. But to get back at him, I guess, he brought a lawsuit against Stiegelmeyer and the Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company, saying that he was basically paying royalties to himself since he had controlling interest in both companies, and so the contract was not legal. So in September of 1923, the judge ruled in favor of the Indianapolis group and said that this contract was null and void, and which threw a real wrench into the works. So Stiegelmeyer started looking elsewhere for his devices. Even though he had invented the device, the Indianapolis company actually owned most of the patent rights to the device that he invented. So in February of 1924, Stiegelmeyer, as part of the Stiegelmeyer Manufacturing Company, purchased controlling interest in a new automatic train control device patented by a company in Rochester, New York, called the Simplex Train Control Company. And it used actually air and electric both in its function. And it wasn't just that device, there were like 4 different devices that he purchased controlling interest in. So the two companies merged into one company, but it was still being explained in the papers that the factory would still be built in Seymour to manufacture these devices. Sorry. Okay, in June of 1924, things were actually patched up between the Indianapolis and Seymour group. It seems that the Indianapolis group couldn't do much with their device without having somebody out selling it. And Stiegelmeyer found that he could use parts from the device that he had invented that the Indianapolis group owned to manufacture the new devices, so they patched things up and wrote up a new contract. But it didn't really last long, because in July of 1924, the Interstate Commerce Commission again extended the mandate on the railroads for compliance with the mandate, but they also changed and said that it didn't have to be an automatic device, that a manually controlled device, which I really don't understand how that would work, honestly, but they said that that would be sufficient, which basically means that all these automatic control devices were no longer be needed, when that was the nail in the coffin for the Stiegelmeyer manufacturing company being built in Seymour, or anywhere for that matter. So backing up just a little bit, in May of 1924, the lot owners in the Stiegelmeyer addition, who owned property rights to the Bollinger property, and the original contract with that said that once the factory was built and was in operation for 5 years, then the deed to the property would be turned over to the company. But they were concerned with the lack of any progress being made up to that point on the property there, and also concerned with there still had not been any construction done in the housing addition as far as streets and that sort of thing yet as well. So they formed a committee called the Seymour Industrial Association, and they made up new contracts with which Stiegelmeyer signed. They said that he would have to pay $125 rent per month to a trust fund, and then after 2 years, depending on if the factory had been started or not, then the money would go to either the stockholders or to the company. Of course, we know now that the factory was never built. So the stockholders now own this 30 acres, or just a little under 30 acres of property, just on the east side of Seymour, because O'Brien Street was the eastern border of Seymour at the time. So in spring of 1925, they actually rented out the land to farmers for growing crops, just to have some income coming in off the property. Let's see, in 1933, in December of 1933, the organization sold the eastern edge of that property to the state, and the state built a new state highway garage on the property. In March of 1935, the state purchased more property and built what was first to be a state police communications relay station, and it eventually became the state police post that the building is still standing today, even though the post is no longer there. But it was actually called the state police barracks at the time. Then in 1936, in March of 1936, the Reliance Manufacturing Company, which is better known around here as the shirt factory, they had been manufacturing out of a building which is actually the Greene's furniture store on South Chestnut Street, but they needed a lot more room, so they had small factories in different towns, and they wanted to combine all those smaller factories into one large factory, and so they purchased bulk of the rest of the property in the Bollinger property to build their new shirt factory along Tipton Street and O'Brien Street there. Said that the estimated cost of the new factory would be $85,000 to $90,000. And then finally in July 1938, the old Bollinger house, which was going to be the factory office space, was sold to the local Moose Lodge for their new lodge building. In the meantime, in the spring of 1926, they finally started grading and graveling the 3 boulevard streets in the Stiegelmeyer addition to the city of Seymour. And finally, starting in the spring of 26 is when they started actually building homes on the lots in the property. Some of the owners of the properties had been using some of their lots for garden spots before that, but they could finally get into the construction equipment and stuff onto the lots because of the new streets being built. Edward Stiegelmeyer in July of 1936 was visiting his old workplace, the fire station in Indianapolis, and he collapsed and died probably of a heart attack at that time. In his obituary, it mentioned the fact, or the addition to the city of Seymour, which is named after him, and talked about the factory site, which was never built, but said in the obituary that even though the lot owners didn't make money off the factory, they did make a good profit off of the property, selling it to other people. So that was the end of Edward Stiegelmeyer. There was, during the lawsuit that was brought up against him, one of the persons that testified against him said that he was a wizard as an inventor, but he was a horrible businessman, and that might sum up his life, maybe. So that's the story of why there's a addition to the city of Seymour named for somebody who never actually lived here and didn't technically own the property. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, post them here on my YouTube channel and I'll get to them. If you liked it, might give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to hear more videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and you'll get a notification. So that's it on this chilly Sunday afternoon. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. Bye. Jezebel says bye too. Thank you. Bye.